Hey everyone, I'm Jay Scherr with Jay Scherr Business Consulting. We help entrepreneurs, business owners, and other leaders maximize their potential, build rock solid foundations for their businesses, and create more freedom in their lives. And you've joined Business Minds Coffee Chat. Ariana Huffington said, "The land of burnout is not a place I ever want to go back to." According to the World Health Organization, burnout is an occupational phenomenon resulting from workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed. Well, on today's episode, we're going to explore the topic of burnout, its signs and impact, the power of expansive intimacy in defeating burnout, and more. My guest is a father, an executive coach, facilitator, author, speaker, and a professional comedian. He leverages his C suite experiences to help leaders and organizations become burnout proof. Please welcome the centered coach himself and the man who's helping us defeat burnout so we can enjoy the success we truly want, Jim Young. Jim, it is so great to see you. Thank you so much for being here today.
Jay, it's a real pleasure. I'm so glad to be in a conversation with you again and to dig into these topics. So thanks for having me on the show.
It is absolutely my pleasure. And, as I had mentioned to you before we started recording the podcast, the conversation that we had had before, it was clear to me within the first 5 minutes that you were definitely someone that I connect with well and someone that I felt would be an incredible guest for this show and someone who would provide remarkable insights. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation. So let's dive right in. I thought a good starting place for us would be to give our audience some context on who you are, a bit about your backstory. And Jim, as you're sharing some of that, if you would share some of the early lessons that you learned in life that have helped shape the person who you are today.
Absolutely. The first lesson that comes to mind is from when I was about 9 years old, and it was a Tuesday night. My mother had recently kicked out her abusive boyfriend who had sort of terrorized our household for a few years at various times. And she said to me, Jimmy, probably, because that's how I went back in the days. It's Tuesday night, it's trash night. And since you're the man of the house, that means you need to take out the trash. And I've reflected on that comment many times over the years. I first had it pop up for me in a therapy session years ago to recognize that I took on an identity at a very young age that I was not ready for. And I never questioned it. I just went forward with what I was supposed to do, even though I was scared, even though I didn't know how, even though it didn't make sense to me. And it was really formative for me in a lot of ways, in that as I grew up, going through adolescence, becoming a young adult, I kept that same mentality. I just went forward with what was expected of me. I worked hard. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for help. And I came to realize much later on that those expectations were coming at me, not just from my mom with that innocent comment that she made, probably trying to prop me up, but that those were messages that I started to get everywhere. I got them from my peers at school. I was just listening to the part of the episode you had with John Fenton about being in that low group in the phys ed class and having these messages that come to us from the boys in our lives, the men in our lives in particular, about what we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to look like to be a man. And so I grew up with this really malformed sense of what healthy manhood was. And I carried that into my career, into my marriage, both of which went really well for a long period of time and produced some amazing things. I have three fantastic children. I had a career that gave me tons of opportunities to influence people and help in a lot of ways. And they both crashed and burned. I divorced in my early 40s. I burned out of my career around the same time. And when I went back and looked at the archaeological dig of all that, I could see that it was this burnout seed, as I call it, of that conversation when I was 8 or 9 years old that started this belief that I then built upon. It was a faulty foundation that got me to a place where in my mid 40s, I really had to start all over again.
So let's stay on the thread of identity because that's obviously in your particular case a an incredibly deep and intrinsic piece of not only your childhood but something that created a ripple effect that went into adulthood as well. So when it comes to identity, and I'd love to be able to speak to this for our general audience as well. In your case, more than likely an innocent comment being made that connected with you, held on to that became part of your belief system and something that you did tie your identity to. For our audience, what is what is something that you would share with them about identity and the ability to recognize, have the self-awareness, and be able to change or reframe that identity?
I'd come back to your introduction. It was really sweet to listen to you list off all of these identities that I have, starting with father, ending with professional comedian, and all the work things that are in between. Those were not always true, of course. And that's the beauty of identity is we may start with a core identity and we may only have one sense of ourselves, but ultimately we will develop many senses of ourselves and they'll change over time. They're never fixed. They're like our beliefs, like that belief of I had to do it all, put it on my shoulders without any help. I can change that. And so taking some time to really sit back and say, what are my identities? Draw a map, get out a piece of paper and draw a figure and then put a bunch of figures around it, right? Draw this identity map of what are all the ways that you see yourself in the world. Some of them may be reflective, how other people see you. Some of them might be the way that only you can see yourself and decide. I think that's the beauty of identity is we get to decide in large part what our identity is, and then our behaviors are gonna prove it.
Well, I think that's good advice. I love the idea of drawing the identity map and then making a decision, right? Who do I want to be? How do I want to show up?
Yeah.
And what beliefs are necessary in order to support that identity and the person who I want to become? So at what point in your life did you recognize, and what was the catalyst that allowed you to recognize and acknowledge that identity that you had held on to for so long?
For me, it didn't happen until I was probably about 42 years old. It was about 10 years ago. And I had reached a point where life had started to fall apart. I had had my head down for so long, kind of in the sand about who I really was. I was just trying to live up to all these other expectations. And when my marriage started to fall apart, I said, boy, I really need some help. I went and I saw a therapist for the first time in my life, and sitting there talking to this therapist, probably through a haze of tears, having this moment come back to me and realizing, oh, wow, I've just let everybody decide what my identity is from man of the house all the way forward. There was no conscious choice in it for me. I was trying to go along to get along, and the results of it didn't work for me. Um, so it was this reckoning moment for me that I had to say, okay, I don't actually know who I am.
So the pieces that you can share of your marriage and ultimately what led to the divorce itself,
Mhm.
the parts of that that were tied to this identity piece, what specifically can you share that created the issues and the challenges that you faced in the marriage? And when you went to therapy, often in therapy, a mirror is held up to our face.
Yeah.
And we begin to recognize things that we didn't necessarily recognize before. So, what was it about therapy that was beneficial to you? And were there aspects of therapy that didn't necessarily resonate, or at least didn't move you in the direction that you wanted to go?
I'll take those questions in reverse. My experience of therapy has been almost entirely positive. I'll say the parts that didn't serve me was going through couples therapy once my ex-wife and I had reached a point of, I think we'd already reached the point of no return and we were going through therapy and it felt like going through the motions. But when I've done individual therapy work, I have shown up for that really willing and ready to look at myself, however it came out, whatever reflection showed up, with an open mind as to how can I improve. So my experiences there have been uniformly beneficial. As to what led to some of that reckoning moment, there was that identity as a 9-year old. There was another key story that came up in my looking back that I realized was a piece of this. And it was actually a conversation with my father-in-law before I had even proposed to my then wife, where he was asking me, we'd just meeting for the first time, and he was trying to suss me out. Who is this guy? I was with my daughter, and he's asking me about my career. And I came out of college without taking my career seriously. I wanted to go skiing. I wanted to have a good time. I had jobs that kept the bills paid, but nothing career oriented. And I remember him asking me about my career, and I gave him this kind of wacky response. And the look of disappointment on his face, this momentary scoff almost of the reaction to my somewhat immature response to his question, really struck me. It landed deeply inside me and said, oh, if I'm going to be a provider for my family, if I'm going to be a protector for my wife, these classic roles that men take on in a family system, if I'm going to be taken seriously by other guys, if I'm going to be an upstanding person, all of these identity based traits, I got to get my act together. I got to go get serious about my career, and I got to go do things that ultimately I didn't really want to do. I remember saying to him, I just don't see myself getting up early every day, putting on a tie and going into an office. That's not for me. He'd been doing that for decades and was very successful. So I think it did not land well, let's say that. And 6 months later, I was getting up early, putting on a tie, going into an office. And I got into a professional career and I excelled in it, but I was wearing a costume the whole time. It wasn't who I really was and what I really wanted to be doing.
What type of costume were you wearing? I can relate to this, but I want to hear from you specifically. How were you showing up that wasn't congruent
Yeah.
necessarily with who you are?
It actually took me a while to realize this, and I think I might have known it at the time. I was in my mid 20s at this point, and one of the things that I loved the most was I was in a garage band, or better yet, a barn band. We hung out in a barn behind my grandparents' house, and we jammed every Thursday night for years. And it was this creative outlet. And I never named for myself that I was a creative person. And I actually am. I really love creativity. I love that in music. I love that in writing. I love that in humor and comedy. And so the costume I wore looked like on the outside me wearing a tie and a jacket into a big professional building. But what the real costume was me turning all that stuff off and playing professional. I should be serious all the time. I should be analytical. And I had those capabilities. I could turn them on, but they weren't really me, and they required effort, and they dulled my edges. Eventually, I stopped playing in the band. Eventually, I stopped going on ski trips. Eventually, I gave myself up so that I could go further and further and deeper into that professional world.
I feel you on that. I have a similar story. I also played music professionally and got out of the barn and on the road a bit.
Uh-huh.
But also, when I jumped into my corporate career, it was very similar that I thought I needed to show up for others a certain way.
Yeah.
So, the first company that I went to work for in my corporate career, it's a suit and tie, very conservative company. And I learned very quickly what it took in order to move up the ranks and climb that corporate ladder. And I was very good at becoming that person.
Yeah.
But something that you said that really that lands well on my heart is that as we do more of that and
Mhm.
become more of that person, we lose more of who we truly are.
Yeah.
And I absolutely experienced that. And it ultimately led to a place where I didn't even recognize myself anymore. But that took many, many, many years
Yeah.
and quite a few very difficult conversations and a lot of deep work on myself. So I feel where you're coming from. And my sense is that those that are watching and listening, there's going to be a percentage of those that this particular piece of the story resonates with them as well. And I think to a large degree, many of us do wear masks and costumes, etc., when we show up in public because there's a fear, at least from my perspective and from my experience, there's a fear that we won't be accepted for who we really are, the
Mm-hmm.
person that we are when we're not out in public, when we're within our own four walls.
Yeah.
So, what was that experience like for you? What did you think about trying to be more like you and what was holding you back in those days from being your true authentic self?
What I've experienced over the last 10 years, where I've become a lot more of who I really am. I think I'm still working on it. I probably will still be chipping away layers till the last day I have. Is that I didn't have to worry about what was out here. And for people just listening, I'm just kind of gesturing outside my body, right? And I learned this very viscerally through a 12-step program that I was a part of. I grew up with, I was in relationship with and had family members with alcoholism. And I went to Al Anon meetings for the first time in about 10 years ago, and learned with other friends and family members affected by that family member's disease that I could just say what was real, and I could hear people say what was real and not judge and really just open up. And it was the first time I walked into one of those meetings, I remember thinking, what are these people doing? How are they possibly sharing these things out loud in a room of strangers and nobody's doing anything about it? They're just listening. And I eventually learned that pouring my heart out in those meetings, and I had a lot to pour out because I had bottled it all up for decades, that was a place where I started to realize who I actually was. I started to let the defenses down. I started to let out the real versions of me, and they were messy and sloppy, and I was figuring it out on the fly. But I started to get some footing, and I started to see, oh, this is what I care about. This is who I actually am at my core. And it's okay because I got validated by that every single time in that space. And I've heard people joke that everybody in the world could benefit from going to some form of a 12-step meeting. I believe in that. I'm not a prescriber of anything. But really, I just think any place where we can be in a place where there's full safety to just be ourselves, that changed me in a profound and fundamental way. And I became a seeker of that. How do I bring my spirit forth? How do I gain consciousness over who I actually am and trust that? And the more I do it, the easier and better life gets. It looks way different than I thought. And it's awesome.
So I'd like you to describe that in a bit more detail. So
Yeah.
once you became more comfortable sharing and having these types of conversations and really opening up your heart, kind of cracking that open to who you really are, which I can share with everyone that's watching and listening right now, that is it is a process to go
Uh-huh.
through. If you have not done that before, and I'm not, whether it's Al Anon or just having conversations, authentic conversations with people, deep, meaningful conversations, if you haven't opened up like that before, it can be intimidating. It can
Mm-hmm.
be scary,
Yeah.
right? Because again, there's the fear of the unknown. Is this person
Mm-hmm.
going to accept me? Am I going to be ridiculed? Am I going to be judged? This just doesn't feel right because we've spent so many years protecting ourselves and
Mm-hmm.
building this armor around us that we really have to work the process to start breaking it down. But I would love it if you would share for us what you began to experience and what was that process like for you as you kind of walk through it and you're able to look back with different optics.
Mm-hmm.
Explain that to us so we can get a good sense of what that's like.
One of the first things that I became aware of was that I had emotions, that I had a whole heap of them, and there was a range of them. People who know me now, probably that's one of the words that they might associate with me in the first five things they would describe as is some version of the word emotion. That was totally not true back then. And it was in those initial shares when I first got the wavering courage to talk up and to speak up in those Al-Anon meetings. Tears started coming out. I was like, I don't know what to do about this, but I'm just going to let them come. And somebody just handed me a box of tissues. That was the only response that I needed. And then somebody put their hand on my shoulder. And I realized it was okay to have emotions. And as I detoxified myself, I heard something a while ago that if you look at tears, if you measure tears, there's toxins in tears. We're detoxifying ourselves when we allow that powerful emotion to come out of us. As I detoxified all the emotions that I had held down in my system, I started to free up this capacity for other things, including joy. It wasn't long after that I started doing improv comedy. On a lark, I decided to go to a day long workshop and I fell in love. It was almost like walking into that first Al Anon meeting and being stunned to see all my people sitting in one room. I found more of them in an improv workshop. And I started realizing that I could use that everywhere. My kids had already been doing improv. That's how I got into it. I saw how much fun they were having. And so we started just goofing around at dinner every night and doing improv. And I brought it into my workplace in different ways. And eventually, when I burned out of my corporate career and relaunched a career, I said, I'm making joy and fun part of my work because that's part of who I am. I get to be somebody who cries and who is looking to be goofy and silly in service of learning. I learn all the time through the laughter that I get to enjoy and that I sometimes get to help create. And so there was this range that opened up. I used to try to keep everything in this tight band in the middle. I had to be under control. And that's one of the rules that I think society puts on us in Western culture, men, probably women as well, but I know that in the male experience. And I said, screw it, I'm not going to be in control all the time. I'm going to let myself be free and be expressive and obviously, situationally appropriate, but finding more and more of those places where I could just be sad, happy, angry, confused, anything in between. That changed everything.
Amazing. Did certain relationships fall by the wayside where new relationships formed and just transformatively impacted your life?
Yeah, certainly. Friendships, certain family relationships have changed as a result. And I learned through my second therapist, who's a family systems therapist, that when we change, the systems that we're in, social systems, family systems, work systems, are going to say, change back. I know what to expect from you already. Don't be a different person because I don't know how to respond to that. And if we just stay with ourselves, if we have the integrity and the clarity to say, no, that's how I'm going to show up, the system will either adapt or it won't. And if it doesn't, then that relationship may have reached the close of its arc and it's time to move on. And I've certainly had that happen. I remember a specific example with my mom. We used to have a lot of sarcasm in our relationship. And I realized at some point that it was unhealthy. It was our way of not really dealing with things. And I stopped doing it. And I remember her saying to me one day, this actually happened more than one occasion. She said, "What happened to my smart ass son?" And I said, "I'm not going to be that guy anymore." And that's changed that relationship, not for the better, unfortunately. She hasn't been able to reconcile with me not playing that game anymore. But I said, I can't do it. It's not good for my soul.
Do you carry forgiveness in your heart today?
Yeah, I work on it all the time
Mm-hmm.
uh, for myself. Yeah, I've learned over the years that forgiveness is not about anyone else. It's about forgiving ourselves for the freedom that that provides and the judgment that we might have over what somebody else is working on and maybe struggling with, and how we might have been harmed by something that in many cases they didn't intend. Uh, so yeah, forgiveness is I think it's a constant challenge of how do I fully forgive? I have plenty of work left to do on that.
As do I. As I hear you tell your story, it almost sends shivers down my spine because I can relate to that in other ways. And I think about, as you were sharing it, it immediately flashed images of conversations that I've had
Yeah.
that didn't land well, that created walls in certain relationships. And forgiveness becomes a very powerful word. And to your point, something that I work on and continue to work on today, and know that I still have a long way to go.
Yeah.
But I recognize that I have to first start with forgiving myself. Then I can work on forgiveness so those relationships can either repair or they can just basically float down the river, if you will. Right.
It's so funny you
So,
said that. I was literally just thinking, I love that you brought in forgiveness because it's soft. It feels like a soft word or soft concept. And I think that's a beautiful quality of forgiveness. It allows us to soften. And it was making me think of, the Grand Canyon was formed. These giant rocks were carved out by something as soft as water. And water, the forgiveness, might carve through and create something new and beautiful. Or if it can't, it will divert, it will go somewhere else. And we just got to try and find as many ways to let it flow as we can.
yeah. Yeah. I love that. So we opened the show talking about burnout and signs of burnout. So you have a very personal story, a very personal journey of burnout, which you write about in your most recent book. Share with our audience at least some of the story behind what transpired for you.
Mm.
And as you're sharing that, I would love it if you could maybe point out some of the specific signs that maybe you didn't necessarily notice then, but now, with as time has passed, what were some of those signs that our audience can learn from and be aware of?
Yeah. You named at the top of the show the definition that the World Health Organization has put on burnout, and that it is a symptom of unmanaged workplace stress. And that is true in many respects. I also want to just bring in that it's not strictly a workplace condition. Stay at home parents can burn out. Solo entrepreneurs who don't have anybody else putting pressure on them within an organization can also burn out. And beyond just organizational factors or workplace factors, there are personal factors. So my people pleasing tendencies are one of the ways that I got into burnout. My perfectionism is another way that I got into burnout. So I was predisposed to it by some personal qualities that I have. I then found workplace cultures that fostered the conditions where I could burn out. So I just wanted to unpack that a little bit further because I think it's important given that we're looking at statistics that show 35-40% of the workforce is experiencing burnout these days. It's nobody should feel guilty for it. Nobody should necessarily demonize their employer for it. We should look at all of it, right? It's a systemic issue and it's a personal issue at the same time. So as I mentioned, perfectionism and people pleasing were two of the variables for me. A lot of that then was played against the expectations that I had of who I was supposed to be. So, kind of coming back to identity. What does a successful man look like? And I'm going to be that guy because I don't want to face the consequence of that. So I worked really hard to get promoted. Once I got into a professional career, into a corporate track, I was a supervisor within a year. I was leading larger teams within a couple of years from that. I very quickly ascended the ranks of different organizations. I moved a couple of times and kept seeking out that next rung because I wanted to win. I remember actually being on mental health leave for a month while I was burned out. I didn't know that's what it was called at the time. My company was going through a major reorganization where we created a new leadership structure. And while still on leave, I showed up for a meeting where I got promoted to be president of the company because that's what I wanted. I wanted that brass ring and I was going to do anything to get it. There was no way I wasn't showing up for that meeting because that would mean I didn't get a seat at the table when we were talking about who could be the leader, even though I was probably at my bottom point. But I rallied because I could, because I'm supposed to be strong, successful. I'm not supposed to reveal the emotions that I have. I'm not supposed to ask for help. Those are the rules that I grew up with. Nobody said them to me. They're all unspoken, but I knew them. And if I didn't obey them, then I was going to be called names. And I'm not going to use them on air because most of them are reprehensible. But what that meant was if I didn't succeed, if I didn't climb that ladder, if I didn't get that promotion, if I didn't have the status, then I was weak. I wasn't man enough. And if I'm weak, then I've got shame. And that's going to feed my perfectionism all over again because those are a cycle. If I've got shame, I'm going to try and be perfect and then I'm going to fail. I'm going to have shame. So there's so much that went into it for me. And I think there's a common pattern around that, around some of those personal qualities and these big societal expectations and different variables like social media or all these other ways to compare ourselves that we fall into this trap of thinking, I'm not going to deal with shame for not being good enough in some way. So I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to double down. That's exactly what I did.
Wow. So let's continue the storyline here. So you're in this meeting, the decision's made that you are now the president.
Yeah.
What happens next? How long are you in this role before things fell apart?
Less than a year. I was still burned out when I took it, but I got this adrenaline hit. I'm like, I made it. I got to the top of the mountain and I was nowhere near ready for it. I still needed to recover from some extreme burnout. I had been divorced for less than a year. I'd lost my grandmother, who was really a maternal figure to me growing up within the prior few months. I'd gone through some serious stressful uh, situations at work, some crises. I just had all of these variables stacked against me taking this big leap in my professional career. But I was like, here's the opportunity. I got to get it. And I think I did okay for a little while. And then I couldn't hold it. And then I had to really do the really hard thing and say, I'm going to leave. I'm not going to, I can't do this. That was so hard.
What was the very next thing that you did after you had that conversation and said, I'm leaving?
Wow. I have not thought about that. Um, I probably went home to my kids. That was salvation for me. I love being a dad. It's my favorite job in the world. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go figure out how to do this job as my primary and not try to fit my life around my work. I'm going to fit my work around my life instead because that's what really matters.
Beautiful. So we turn the time frame up a bit. You start your own business.
Mm,
You found incredible meaning in what you do,
yeah.
your purpose, if you will.
Yeah.
So share with us what you do in your current business.
Mm,
How do you serve and how are you transforming and changing other people's lives?
mm. About 3 or 4 months before I ended up taking another corporate job after I left that president job because I didn't know what to do next. I found a job so I could pay the bills and still burned out. And about 3 or 4 months before I left that job, I went to a workshop in Boston. Ari Weinzweig, who's one of the founders of Zingerman's, very successful family of businesses in Ann Arbor, Michigan, starting with a deli back in 1982, and now this really rich set of family of businesses. I I'd seen him speak before. I'd been reading his work for years, and I went to a workshop of his. And we did a visioning exercise where I sat down and I wrote on what I would be doing for work in 3 years' time. That's a prompt I chose, and somewhere in that sheet, I still have it somewhere. I wrote down, I'm helping people find the calm, centered place from which they do their best at work and life. That's why I'm called the Centered Coach. That's why I named the business that, because that's exactly what I want to be doing is helping people be their real selves, be connected to themselves, and then connected authentically to others. And that's everywhere. That's at home with their kids, their spouse, whoever's in the house, whatever their family looks like. It's also with their colleagues and it's also with friends because a lot of people lose their friendships over time. We don't invest the time in it. So I wanted people to be centered in themselves so that they could be available to all of that. The way that looks today, when I first started the business, one of the words you didn't use to describe that was terrified. I had no idea what I was doing at 47 years old, starting a business for the first time. And it was completely terrifying. I had quit my job on the spot. Not on, I gave 2 weeks notice or something like that, but I didn't have a plan. I just walked in with a resignation letter and no plan. Said I'm going to go figure out the next thing. Um, and what I have found over time is I love to coach people. I love to coach within organizational settings to help people create these sustainable ways of being. You know, what are the gifts that you bring? How do you connect as people in ways? And I bring things like improv into that. I just did a workshop with a client I've been working with for several months. They're forming a new leadership team, and I help them learn emotional intelligence skills through improv. So they're playing and laughing, but learning really critical skills in these low stakes environments so that when they get to the high stakes environment, they know how to be with each other more authentically in a more real way, have the direct conversations that they need that have candor and care in them, but also don't hold anything back. And I love watching people make that transition into this place where they can now be real with each other and hold care for each other and be really focused on us, not us versus them, And I do that through a lot of means. I do executive coaching. I do facilitation of events and workshops. I do some gender equity work through an organization called Next Up. I do that in deeper engagements with organizations to help them burnout proof themselves. And I love every minute of it.
Yeah, that is so wonderful. So, speaking of improv and bringing that into the organizational culture, at least through the coaching that you do when working with these different organizations, can you give us an example? Because it's such an interesting topic. Can you give us an example of how you would use improv in an organization, maybe an exercise or something that our audience could take away and maybe apply in their own businesses?
Yeah, let's do it right now.
Okay.
So you and I, we're going to play a game called Last Letter, First Letter. And this is to hone our listening skills. It's one of the most critical skills for leaders and everybody else. We're all leaders. But when we listen deeply to people, we open up room for empathy. We get seen and heard better. We're more connected, right? So lots of benefits. So we're gonna do a short conversation, and I'll have you start. When you finish your sentence, and it can be about anything, it can be about the weather, doesn't matter what. I'm going to start my response using the last letter of the last word you spoke as the first letter of the first word that I speak. You follow?
Okay. I believe so.
Okay. So,
Okay.
and then I'll respond to you, and you need to respond in kind. So you need to listen all the way to the last letter of what I speak, and then start your response with that letter.
Okay. Fair enough. So, Jim, I understand that you enjoy snowshoeing. When was the last time you went snowshoeing?
Gee, I think it was actually 2 winters ago because we didn't get enough snow last winter. And I'm really looking forward to doing it on Saturday.
Yes, that is fantastic. So, do you typically take your kids when you go snowshoeing?
Guessing that I don't, because they don't have snowshoes. I typically do it with my partner, who actually introduced me to snowshoeing just a couple of years ago.
Oh my gosh.
You got
That
it.
is so cool.
So that's the
Okay, so I
exercise.
could see that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, and the default listening mode that we're usually in is we're thinking while people are talking, we're preparing our response, and we're missing what they're saying. We're missing what they're conveying to us. So it's a simple exercise that uses some of the ideas of restriction that we use in improv scenes to force us to get to a full listening experience.
That's brilliant. Do you give prompts other than these are the rules, or is it just wide open? Just go, just have the conversation.
Yeah, oftentimes I'll provide prompts because when I'm giving a workshop around whatever topic using applied improv in a corporate setting, people don't know improv. So oftentimes I'll teach them yes and is one of the first things that we learn. And I'll say, okay, the prompt is you're planning the company picnic, right? Give them something kind of innocuous that they can create from, and then give a structure that they then have that conversation within, just like we created a structure for that last letter, first letter. There are a lot of different structures. And now let's give you something to play with. It could be something ridiculous, or it could be something that's more grounded and practical. Just kind of depends on the situation.
So I want to speak to your book here for a moment, Expansive Intimacy.
Yeah.
And obviously, with the amount of time we have, we can't go into a tremendous amount of detail in the book itself, but I want to at least highlight a few things about the book. First, the name, the title of the
Yeah.
book. Share with all of us what expansive intimacy means to you and how did you choose that as the title?
Yeah. I actually first spoke the words on my first date with my life partner when she asked me what I wanted out of a relationship. And I said, I want it to be expansively intimate. And I didn't even know what I meant at the time, but it came from my somewhere inside me. And as I've unpacked it over the years, what I realized is my path out of burnout started when I opened myself up, when I got not just vulnerable, but intimate. there was reciprocity in my relationships where I wanted to know people at a real level. And I wanted to know people at a real level. Once I started, I wanted it everywhere. And I found that it's available. It wasn't just with family members or romantic partner, but it was also with my friends. I could also have it with colleagues in a certain way. So there's a range of intimacies that we have. And we, as a society, put it in such a narrow box that we think of it as a romantic or sexual concept. That's absolutely true. And there's so many other variations of intimacy. And when we unlock that full box, we have a set of tools that keeps us connected and gets us supported. We can have celebration with people and we can grieve with people and everything in between.
Well, that's exactly what you provide in this book. It truly is a roadmap with a set of tools based on personal experience as
Yeah.
well as other experiences that you have.
Yeah.
And I would share with our audience that the book, the way that you have brought this book to life, it's really broken down into three primary parts. You want to give us the big topics for each of
Yeah.
those three sections?
Yeah, the first one's burnout and really dissecting burnout from a bunch of angles because I think it's poorly understood still. It's helping people understand the way that it manifests personally in organizations and so on. The last section is obviously on expansive intimacy, this concept that I realized had gotten me out of burnout. And I wanted to tell that story. And as I was writing, my developmental editor asked me a key question as I was writing some of the burnout section about the role that stigma played in something that I had a study that I had quoted. And as I started to research that, I realized there was this other piece, and it's shame. That shame is this troll that lives under the bridge between burnout and expansive intimacy, that we have shame about opening ourselves up fully to other people, and that holds us back from intimacy. We also have, as I referenced in my burnout story, this shame of not living up to what we're expected to be. And so we can work ourselves into a state of burnout. And then once we get into burnout, we might feel even more shame because we failed in some way. We want to avoid that at all costs. And yet, as Brene Brown taught me, the way out of shame is by sharing it. And when we share our shame, we create a bond with somebody that is the seed of intimacy. So it's this really interesting, interconnected set of concepts that I didn't understand shame as the key piece in the center of it until I was writing the book.
Wow. So, Jim, I would ask that you take a moment and speak directly to our audience members who are experiencing shame right now.
Mm.
What would you say directly to them?
If you're not familiar with the difference between guilt and shame, start there. Guilt is I did bad. Shame is I am bad. And really look at that honestly for yourself and say, in my heart, am I bad? Have I really not lived up to being a good person? And I think most of us would recognize that no, that's not true. It's this external comparison. It's this way that we think we have to be, that we didn't quite make it to, we weren't perfect in some way. And then I would say, find the safe person. I'm going to go to Fred Rogers here. Look for the helpers, right? Who's the safe person in your life who you can talk to about anything? Is it your sister? Is it a therapist? Is it a coach? Is it your best friend? Whoever it is, and start that conversation because it will free you when you start to say, I'm feeling kind of shameful because whatever. And when I've done that with the right people, and not everybody has the right to hear our story, when we do it with the right people, invariably what I get is, oh, I know what that's like. And then I realize I'm not alone. I'm just having a human experience and I'm laying a lot on myself. And now I can be bonded with somebody and we can work through it.
That's beautiful. As part of the opening of the book, you share that you created a playlist
Yeah.
that you created on Spotify of the artists and the songs that served, I think, to use your word, as guides as you
Mm-hmm.
wrote this book.
Yeah.
I went through your playlist, and many, probably most of those songs are songs that are on various playlists of mine. But I wanted to ask you if, as I name these titles, I'd like you to speak to why these particular songs were chosen. And
Yeah,
I'm not going to name all of them, but there's
there's a lot.
certain
Yeah.
ones that, yeah, there's certain ones that stood out to me.
Uh-huh.
So first, Hey Hey My, Heroes,
Yeah.
In the Dark,
Mm.
Shame Shame,
Mm-hmm.
The Pretender,
Mm.
Loser, and Time to Move On.
Mm.
Very interesting, eclectic choice of song titles and artists.
Yeah. Hey, hey, my has the lyric in it. It's better to burn out than to fade away. And I think we take that lyric literally sometimes, too literally. Heroes by David Bowie has the lyric in it, we can be heroes if just for one day. And that's about showing up for ourselves, even just in one day. Shame Shame is a song by Foo Fighters. It's maybe a little bit of a deep cut. It's more of a recent, of one of their more recent albums. And the lyrics of that are so profound. I remember when I first heard it, it brought me to tears. Um, I'm not going to remember him in the moment, but Dave Grohl talks about shame as being like this splinter beneath the skin, and that we bury it, and that there's this deep well of shame that we could tap into, and how scary that can be. Um, which ones haven't I gotten to?
In the Dark.
In the Dark by Billy Squire. I love that song, and I hadn't heard it in a long time. And there are lyrics in there as well that just evoke this place of like, we hide things in the shadows, and that if we meet those things in the dark, if we can have the courage to show up in the dark moments, then we can go through. And it's a really hopeful song for me when I translated it through the lens of burnout. um, Time to Move On is just thinking about that song gets me like, I just feel a well of emotion coming up. It was a song that I listened to over and over again, oftentimes lying on the floor in my living room with the lights down low on a Friday night, all, home alone by myself, and listening to that song and realizing that sometimes it's time to move on. It's time to get going. What lies ahead, I have no way of knowing. But under my feet, baby, grass is growing. And just an encouraging song to be able to grieve the putting down of a phase of life and say, okay, I got to get up and I got to go in a new direction. And it's held me for quite a while.
Well, there were a couple others that I mentioned,
Oh,
but
Loser was in there too. And that's a
yes.
little playful. I mean, I love Beck, and it's such a playful song in a lot of ways. And it's this self-deprecating song that also has a lot of truth in it about the stories we might tell ourselves about not living up to some BS kind of standard. And like, I'm a loser, baby. Why don't you kill me? Like, really? Is that the mantra we're gonna go by? So that one's a little bit cheeky.
And then The Pretender.
Oh, The Pretender. There's a lyric in there about kind of like an angel and devil on our shoulders. There are these voices that are speaking to us, and who are we going to listen to? When we look in the mirror, are we going to, are we going to face into who we really are? Are we going to listen to the whispers that tell us that we're not who we think we really are?
So good.
Yeah.
I think
So
it's
glad you love the
amazing.
playlist.
Yes, I think it's amazing that you compiled that list because it tells such an incredible story as you try to find the through lines, as you try to find the commonality.
Yeah.
And when I take that playlist, it doesn't have to be played in that particular order, but not only does it tell its own story, but it mirrors so much of what you've shared here today. And I can understand when I looked at it and started listening to the songs why those. I
Yeah,
knew
you
it.
can even look at the titles in a lot of cases. You can see Numb by Gary Clark Jr., and you can think, okay, how does that connect? There's probably some pretty obvious links. So yeah, I hope people
Absolutely.
enjoy that. I actually had written a lot of the lyrics into the book before realizing you can't do that without the record companies charging you a ton of money. So I was like, darn it, I'll put a playlist in.
Well, I thought it was a brilliant idea. And for all of you that are watching and listening right now, as I mentioned, we will provide a link to the book in the show notes. In the book itself, you will find a QR code that will take you directly to that playlist. So if you want to check it out for yourself, you are certainly welcome to do so. One other thing I wanted to ask you about as we wrap up our conversation before I ask you my final question, and that is this. So, there is actually a scientifically designed or developed assessment that accurately and ethically measures burnout.
Yeah.
I believe this is an assessment that you use in the work that you do. Can you just very briefly touch on that so we have a general understanding of what it is and
Yeah.
how it's used and the information that is provided as a result of taking that assessment?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked. It's called the Maslach Burnout Inventory. It's developed by Christina Maslach and her colleagues, one of the preeminent researchers into burnout. And it provides a score of where you sit on those three symptoms of burnout that I think Jay may have mentioned at the top of the show: exhaustion, cynicism, and a lack of professional efficacy or sense of accomplishment. It also has an associated piece that shows what are the causes for you. And there are 6 causes: workload, community, fairness, values, control, and what's the other one? Reward. So it helps us see what might be causing our burnout and where are we at on a spectrum. And it creates a profile for each person who takes it of, are you in burnout or are you somewhere on that spectrum? I've used it with corporate clients on multiple occasions to help them just get a sense of how's this living in our organization and what do we need to do about it.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So I have links to all of your social handles, your website, where the book can be purchased. We'll make sure, obviously, to put that in the show notes as well. So here is my final question to you. What is one of the most difficult decisions that you've had to make in the pursuit of who you've become?
I think it's one that I'm still making all the time. And it's to step outside of my comfort zone and show who I really am in front of audiences that I think are expecting something different from me. And it's to be true to myself, and it's to say, I am silly and I have a huge heart. I care about people, and to go against the grain of what society has told me I'm supposed to be like, regardless of where I am. If with my client who pays me the most money, or if I'm at an improv show with 60 people in the audience, just being who's there right now is the hardest thing for me sometimes. And it's also the thing that sets me free.
Jim, I want to thank you so very much for joining me today on Business Minds Coffee Chat. I am truly grateful. I appreciate you opening your heart, you being yourself, being authentic, being true to who you are, and telling it like it is. So thank you for sharing your insights and your wisdom and your experience with all of us. I know that not only do you create transformation in the lives of those that you work with, but your words today on this episode will also create transformation in many people's lives. So thank you so very much for that.
Jay, thank you for creating the space for these conversations. I love what you're doing, the forum you're creating. So I really appreciate having the chance to talk with you today.
It is my pleasure. And for all of you, thank you so very much for watching and for listening. And I do have a favor to ask. Would you please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review on Apple Podcast? That helps us out tremendously. It helps this podcast grow, and it helps us expand its reach as well. So please do that. And to enjoy more episodes, All you need to do is visit jscherbusinessconsulting.com, click on the podcast button. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, pick up a copy of Expansive Intimacy, and we'll see you on the next Business Minds Coffee Chat. Take care, everybody.